Okay, I think we are on air now. And we're just waiting for Tendor and Sundula to join. There's Tendor. We're on air, Tendor, just so you know.
Yep. Where's Sundu?
Sundula should be here. I'll just make sure he can.
I think Sundu is coming up from.
Sundu's coming up from what?
He's just climbing up from the Kangi hill with his backpack.
Where is? Oh, there he is.
Yeah,
there's a serious face. So the way it's working right now is, oh, I think we have a viewer. So regardless of how many viewers we have, we are recording this, so we'll post it. So everything right now is live and ready to go. We have a few viewers, which is exciting. Hopefully not all just our family and friends.
I just posted the link on Facebook. Maybe you guys can throw it there really quickly also.
Sure, yeah. And Sundula seems to be having a little trouble. We just tested with him and everything was fine. So hopefully he can come back here.
I'm going to post it on Twitter as well one more time.
Okay.
Screenshot 찍힌대요.
Huh. I think, let me just chat with Sundu over here and see if he needs help.
Copy link address.
So we'll just get started in a few minutes. I think we have 4 viewers out there. See, Sundula is green. Okay, we'll just give it 2 more minutes here and then we'll start. We can probably start without Sundu and then we can he can join on. He might need to jump in a taxi and head up to your place, Dorji said that.
I can.
Yeah, it should be fine, right? Everything was working fine just now.
Yeah, he was fine before, so I don't know why this wouldn't be working now. Let me just, I'm going to test out this. So there's a Q&A function here. Okay, so I can already see one question. So we are ready to roll. We'll start with our questions and then we'll go to these.
Okay.
But anybody who's watching, our 5 viewers, please feel free to add questions. 7 viewers. Please feel free to add questions at any point if you are wanting to ask something, and we will try to get to them as we go. We have a few questions that we were going to answer just to get the discussion going, and then we will go from there.
Okay. All right, so it's 12:06 now. So we'll just start, yeah?
Yeah, let's wait one more minute here because we just lost a few viewers. I'm not sure, maybe if interested to see how this connection works.
Well, let me call Sundu.
Thanks.
Yeah, maybe call him. I just sent the link one more time.
Oh, there he is.
Oh, Zundu joined.
Great.
Okay, there we go. Zundu, can you hear us? Can you hear us, Zundu? Yeah.
I can hear you. Do you hear me?
Yeah,
yes,
we can hear you
great.
Fine.
Okay,
All right.
good. Let's get going. And
are we good to go?
Yeah, I think we are good to go. Thank you guys for joining. Thank you to our viewers, and we will start.
All right. Thank you, everyone. My name is Tendor, and I'll be moderating this discussion, this informal discussion between four friends, longtime friends and colleagues, partners in crime in the Tibet movement, in the Tibetan freedom struggle. So we have basically right now in this discussion, Zundu, Ladu, Dorsete, and I will just skip long intros and we'll go straight to some of the key questions that have been on a lot of people's mind recently. We know because in the movement there has been a number of things happening over the recent months, and some of these factors or events and developments have been quite serious, making many people in the Tibet movement feel or ask these challenging questions about whether there is any hope for Tibet. And especially in recent months, there has been a ton of media coverage, stories and articles about how difficult the Tibet issue is becoming, and how the Chinese government is growing more and more powerful, or how its economy is doing well, or at the same time within the Tibet movement, how His Holiness the Dalai Lama is getting older, how he's aging, and most recently in the New York Times Magazine article, the big title, "The Last Dalai Lama," with a question mark. So all these end of days kind of scenario for the Tibet movement have made a lot of Tibetans, plus our longtime friends and supporters, quite concerned about what is really happening in the Tibet movement, what is really happening to the Tibet issue, what is happening to the Tibetan cause, how are we doing? Where is the Tibet issue today? So my first question for all of us is, where is the Tibet movement right now? Where do you see as the status of the Tibet movement, or the position that we are in right now? How are we doing? Anyone can take it up first. Is it really as bad as the perception? Yeah, please go ahead, Sundu.
I'm Tenzin Sundu. I'm at the moment in Dharamshala, speaking from here and joining. This is now 10:40. Well, I look at the whole Tibetan movement from a much larger perspective. Gone are the days when.
Could I just ask you to turn down the volume on your own computer? If you turn down your volume a little bit, then we won't hear the feedback unless you can use the earphones. But it's fine.
Is it okay? Now?
Better. Thank you. Sorry.
Is it okay?
Yeah.
Now? Better? Is it okay? Okay. So I usually look at the freedom struggle. Although we work from on the inside, it is always important to take a step back and look at the larger picture. Those were the times when freedom struggles for democracy, struggles for liberty, freedom of expression, struggles against dictatorship. There was a time when people used to struggle alone. It's a globalized world now. Everybody is connected to everybody else. So is the Tibetan freedom struggle. It is not enough for just the Tibetans to continue to struggle, and it is not us alone. The Tibetan freedom struggle is linked and interconnected to India's security, for example, It's also connected to business for a number of Western countries with China. It also has to directly do with the freedom within China and how much the Chinese people are struggling for democracy and freedom in their own country. And also the other occupied countries, for example, East Turkestan, Southern Mongolia. So where I see at the moment the Tibetan freedom struggle is comparing to 1959, 1960, when the exiled Tibetans came into India for the first time, when struggle was really difficult there inside, or through difficult times in the changing scenario in communism. But here is time now. We are united from inside. We are much more politically aware. We are the whole issue of Tibet is known around the world. And most importantly, China is showing more and more signs of bitterness within their own country and a lot of problems emerging in their own country. And China's international relationships, however big their commerce, their global trade is, also is showing signs where there's a diversification of such kind of investments from around the world. So looking at all these factors together, we are at a time where we are very positive about our own movement, where whatever we can do, and there are a number of positive signs we are seeing around the world, which are promising for us for a positive future.
I think those are there. Do you want to go next?
Yeah. So as we ask this question now, like, where is Tibetan freedom movement at this stage? I think it's really important to understand after almost 57 years of Chinese brutal occupation, Tibetan people inside Tibet has not given up their hope for freedom. And as China always try to project issue of Tibet as a issue of His Holiness Dalai Lama, but what we see inside Tibet, how Tibetan people have not given up, and not only that, how Tibetan people had resist all this time. And as you mentioned about in the recent time, there are some kind of issues that are now some kind of questions that are being asked, like how does the Tibet movement look like? But when I see inside Tibet, especially in the recent time, Tibetan people has stood against Chinese rule by overcoming their fear, because as in any part of the world, any dictator use fear to suppress people and control people, and Tibetan people has become more fearless. And as we came to know that only in 2015 now, in just 1 year, over 30 Tibetan ex-political prisoner released, and those Tibetan political prisoners were welcomed by Tibetans as a hero in the Tibetan freedom movement, as we can say, Domakyap, who was recently released, and we have Kesan Sonam, Ronge Ada, Pema Rinzin. I just want to name these few individuals, how the act of resistance against the Chinese rule has been considered as a heroic act, and how Tibetan people, hundreds and thousands, have started now joining them. It's a sign that Tibetan movement is growing inside Tibet. And as long as Tibetan people continue to resist, as long as the suppression inside Tibet to the Tibetan people continue, Tibetan movement will never die, and this movement will continue to fight against the Chinese rule.
Yeah, if I can just add to that, I feel like the key is, if you look at what's happening in Tibet today in terms of Chinese policy, and in terms of newly announced or existing policies where they're just relentless. You know, they're not letting up. They're focusing, seems now as some recent announcements from August and September, they're going to focus more intensely even on the monasteries and on the, you know, monks, and trying to crack down, even sort of more strictly control Tibetan religious leaders, figures inside Tibet. I think what we have to, so we hear the news that we hear outside, despite all of the inspiration and the hope we get from the resistance, the news that we constantly hear from the Chinese side is that they're unrelenting, and that they are unwilling to move or respond to the Tibetan side, and that they're, you know, more and more effective in shutting His Holiness out of, you know, whether it's a country itself like South Africa, or whether it's meetings with world leaders. This kind of, you know, the lack of movement on the issue on the global level, and in fact what appears to be some backsliding, that is extremely difficult for people to hear day after day, day in and day out. And that is, I think, for the general Tibetan population, certainly in exile, you know, people feel like we've been fighting so long, we kind of aren't getting anywhere, and you know, it's too depressing. You know, it's just too awful, and it doesn't seem like there are any creative strategies or new ideas on the table. I feel like that just is the sense that people have on the outside, sort of overwhelmingly, certainly when I talk to people. But I feel like, as Sundu and Dorsethan have said, we really need to adjust our frame and the way that we look at this. I don't feel like we want to minimize or be Pollyanna about the great challenges that Tibet movement is facing, and that Tibetans are facing inside Tibet, most importantly. But I think we need to, like Sundu suggested, adjust the frame of how we're looking at this overall, how many years of struggle we're talking about, how going back into our history and thinking of, you know, how many times Tibetans must have felt like it was lost. You know, it was the odds were just stacked against us, from the invasion and occupation, from the immediate aftermath of the uprising, from, you know, those early days in India in exile, and what was just a human, you know, a refugee crisis, crisis of survival of exiled Tibetan population, let alone being able to do anything to help Tibetans inside Tibet. The world knew nothing about Tibet, very little anyway. And then the Cultural Revolution. I mean, when I was growing up, it was the little rays of hope with the, you know, the protests in the 80s and the loosening of the policy inside central Tibet. And then what do we have? The 90s, the Strike Hard campaign, Jiang Zemin, the building of the railway. It constantly feels like, if you go back and look, we feel like things are so bad. It's kind of the end. I remember when they started destroying Tibetan homes in the traditional Tibetan areas around the Potala, and, you know, when they were remaking Lhasa in the 80s and 90s, I mean, people just said Tibet was unrecognizable. You know, Lhasa was unrecognizable almost, and everybody sort of was despairing as the railway was going to open. But despite, in each and every case, despite the bad news that pours out of Tibet and the Chinese policy and their unrelenting, unchanging ways, there are these consistent waves of resistance inside Tibet. And I think if you look outside Tibet, you see a new generation of Tibetans that is engaged, is absolutely concerned, caring about, active, better educated, and more able to be active on the issue, who want to do more and be involved. So if we're talking about what, you know, what the future has, what the future holds, the current situation, of course, seems difficult, and we have a lot of significant challenges, but on some level, some things haven't changed. Times are just still tough, but Tibetans continue to fight and continue to resist, and the difference is we have global support and a spotlight that may not be what we want it to be yet, may not be all that we need it to be. The Chinese are still rising in their power, but it's far from over.
So, Laden, quickly, actually, I'm receiving a couple of messages from people. Some saying that they can tune in and watch and hear this, but a couple of people are saying they they see a blank page when they log in, and then one person was saying that they cannot hear any audio. But yeah, is there any messages in the public forum that people are sending, just like?
Yeah, I don't know what that. I think that must just be
Right.
issues people are having with.
But it seems like at least, yeah, like some people are able to hear all this
People
stuff.
are
Yeah.
here, and there are questions.
Okay, that's great. So yeah, before moving on, I'll just really quickly take this opportunity to explain to people who may be tuning in and who will watch this afterward. Zundu is, one of the most well-known, most recognizable Tibetan poet and activist, and he's tuning in from Dharamsala right now, from his Rangzan ashram, from his palace in Lower Dharamsala. And Dorjes Heten is director of SFT Asia director, one of the key leaders in the international NGO that is Students of Free Tibet International, and he has been one of the most vocal and admired kind of leader in the Tibet movement, and especially the grassroots activist movement. And Ladun spent a number of years in the Tibet movement as the executive director of Students for Free Tibet back in the day, many years ago, when she was young. So, and right now, Ladun is the director of Tibet Action Institute, and Dorjes is tuning in from Dharamsala. Also, Ladun is speaking to us from California. And our next question that we're going to move into, the next point of discussion is, I think one of the reasons why many people feel this kind of urgency, or sometimes this kind of despair about our movement, being in the movement, may actually be less to do with how powerful China is, but actually more to do with some of the internal problems that we are having. And I think one major challenge that a lot of people have been talking about is actually an internal challenge, which is the divide between those advocating for autonomy, middle way, versus those advocating for Rangzhen. And I think there is definitely some truth to the idea that this is actually a big divide nowadays. This perception is true to some huge extent, actually. And in recent years, the divide between autonomy and independence, or middle way and Rangzhen advocates, although both sides are approaching this from the best motivations, there's no doubt about the motivations. They both sides mean the best for Tibet, and both sides are very actively trying to seek solutions for the Tibet issue. But at the same time, in this kind of belief in our own positions or our own approach, the divide between these two sides have become kind of disruptive to the movement, or become greater in recent years. So my question here would be, what are some of the ways in which we can resolve this particular challenge? Is there a way out of this kind of internal impasse or internal deadlock?
Can I go first?
Yes, please.
Yendor.
Yes, go ahead. Sundula.
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm here. So I would actually want to have much more dynamic ideological debate between Rangzhen and Umelam, and I think it's absolutely fine to have that kind of stance debate, and it must be there. There should be. So that kind of debate will actually help both the lobbyists, both the people who stand for different political stands, to come and debate and sharpen the debate further, so that the rest of the people will get to make their own decision. I think that is absolutely fine, and all freedom struggles, all struggles for democracy, or struggles against dictatorship, they've always done this, both in terms of the goal as well as methods. Um, I still do not see the divide that we see within the community as a divide between Rangzin and Umalam. I do not see this. What I see is how people, those who speak for Umalam, for example, would think that what we are doing is the Dalai Lama's wish, that this is the wish of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and out of our faith and respect for him, we are following this. And those who are not following the middle way approach, they are not listening to, or they do not have the respect to His Holiness the Dalai Lama's vision for autonomy and all of that. I think that is one of the stance that is dividing. One. On the other hand, there are also some people who have been marked at as those who kind of say bad things to His Holiness, or those who do not those who say disrespectful things to His Holiness. I think these are the points that are now being marked for people who speak for independence or people who speak for autonomy. And therefore, one of the things that I think a solution is to really have that kind of unity within the community. Unity is not that everybody has the same and same kind of political stance. The unity can be achieved by having same motivation to work for the Tibetan national struggle and for the Tibetan people, which is actually the desire, the wish of His Holiness the Dalai Lama himself. So this common motivation can really unite us, and therefore whatever political stance others have, we can actually look at this as a practice of democracy, where I hold my own position and I respect whatever other people's political positioning may be, and think that their political stance may be different, but we all work for the common cause, and that common cause is for Tibet, the nation, and the Tibetan people, and our motivation will unite us. And this is how I look at it. I speak for independence of Tibet, and I respect people who speak for Umalam, and I have equal respect for that.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore it doesn't divide me. It doesn't make me feel anything bad about other political stance. And I think these are the ways to really move forward. But then today we are discussing non-violence method as the viable means for the Tibetan freedom struggle.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. Dotseden, do you want to add to what Zindu just said?
Yeah, just want to share one of my experience with an interaction with one of Indian media. When I got a call and I was asked that that there's a big division in the community now, in the movement, and first thing I try to tell that person is we should not perceive differences as a division, because differences in the community, in any community, it's likely to happen because we are different people, and through different views, different approach, we try to build a society, and we try to work, as Sundu said, that unity should not be, unity is not something that we want uniformity in every aspect. And particularly in the Tibetan freedom movement, I think why it is important from the strategic point of view, having different approach also increase our leverage. Because if you have only one approach, then if China, of course our right now the oppressor rejects that approach, then what are other options we have? And how different approach increase our leverage to bring China on negotiation table. Through strategic point of view, I think it is really important that not only two, there can be like 5, 6 different approach. And also right now, I also feel that since Tibetan democracy, it's a kind of new democracy, and people are trying to learn and work, and there's so many discussions happening. This discussion can be also considered from the positive point of view, not always like negative. Some people, of course, get like a little bit over concerned at the same time that now, okay, and then we start panicking. But at the same time, as I said, we should also understand right now at this stage of the movement, from our exiled government approach of middle way to gain genuine autonomy for Tibet has not been succeed, not because that we haven't pushed enough or we haven't done enough, or it's because of His Holiness Dalai Lama, but we haven't achieved the autonomy because China is not being sincere. China is not being sincere to His Holiness Dalai Lama, and China is not being sincere to address the grievance of Tibetan people. And because of that, because of this hardline policy, we haven't, because this kind of dialogue, when there is a dialogue, there should be an agreement from the mutual side. And Tibetans have done its best. His Holiness Dalai Lama has done its best. And China know it very clearly what His Holiness has been doing all this year. But China didn't acknowledge that and didn't sincerely address that. And now situation inside Tibet is more than ever critical, that we all know. So therefore, I think it is really important for us to reflect ourselves. And I think having this different approach and having, not because that I believe in independence, but I feel like there should be a different approach, and there should be a stronger ask to China and stronger international pressure to China so that they come on the table. So I think, yeah, these are a few points. First thing is like our own perception, like how we can appreciate and how we can appreciate the differences, and how through these differences, through discussions and debate, how we can strengthen our movement. If we go in that way, I think we can still bring more positive thing in the movement.
And Lauren?
Yeah, I think there are a couple of things. One, I would say for certain that, as Sundula said, as His Holiness is aging and the Chinese appear to be unmoving, and they've dug in, it looks like, for the long haul. I think that Tibetans in general, certainly in exile, have become, are getting more and more insecure and feeling more and more fearful and uncertain about the future. And people who are motivated by fear and uncertainty, quite often they make bad decisions and they can act badly, because the more insecure and fearful you're feeling about an uncertain future, the less able you are to maybe think and act clearly. And I think we're seeing this play out in our society. We're certainly seeing it play out on social media, but in every home, in every community. And then compound that with, unfortunately, a lack of political knowledge and education, and a lack of truly free and sort of open media, I would say, and a democracy that's fledgling. And I think it's sort of, we have the conditions for hard times, and a lot of actually economic and other disparity in our community. So these are tough times, as we all know, and I think that contributes to this. When Sundula said this question is really about His Holiness, I think it is in a lot of ways. I think there are plenty of people out there who would change their minds in a second if His Holiness was to say something different than what he's said until now. But for them, all they can understand is, on some level, is, this is a question of loyalty and allegiance to His Holiness, and and for them that's the deciding factor, and their motivation is good. They don't have bad motivation. And from the other side, I think people who are impatient with the fact that there has not been change, there has not been movement, seemingly the middle way is not working. Again, I would agree that the main issue here is nothing's really working on some level because the Chinese don't want it to work. They're not willing to move, and we're not willing to push harder because we are limited in our belief of what's possible. But I think that I feel like there are a lot of people out there who speak very loudly on this issue, and who, in our community, who have strong opinions, but they're not really necessarily doing much. They're not active. I think you really need to look to the people who are active and who are working on the issue and who are out there lobbying or campaigning or engaged in all the different kinds of grassroots and other activity from the Tibetan government side or the NGO side. And I think a lot of these people are just doing the work and actually know how to have civilized discussions and know how to, for the most part, work together. And that gets lost in this idea that everybody's divided. And unfortunately, sometimes I would say that people who are doing the hard work on the ground in the exile struggle, their voices get drowned out by the maybe more general, less informed and educated kind of opinions. And that's just, I think that's true for any society. And I think the key is keep our eyes on the prize, which is the situation inside Tibet does not benefit. If we're trying to help the situation on the ground inside Tibet improve, it does not benefit us or people inside to be, locked in a battle amongst ourselves. It's just not useful. It's not helpful.
So, Ladin, one thing you just brought up about how these differences of opinion, difference of ideas, different approaches, they exist in every struggle. It is, not something unique to the Tibet movement. It's everywhere. But I think, compared to a lot of other struggles, one way in which the Tibet movement has been fortunate so far, or at least have some ground for agreement between both Rangzhen advocates and middle way advocates, is the idea that we are committed to nonviolent methods or nonviolent practice, in our struggle, and I think that's really a very interesting place to start in terms of, because I think that also gets lost in the discussion a lot of the times, when we focus on how each group is different from the other or how we are different from each other. But I think within the common ground of our being committed, both sides or all sides being actually committed to nonviolent resistance and nonviolent methods, there is still a question in some people's mind about the effectiveness of nonviolent action as a tool for liberating nations. And I've seen this in discussions over social media, as well as in other panel discussions, in informal kind of discussion and chats with people in the movement or people outside the movement and our supporters. There's this idea that, of course, it is true that India won its independence through nonviolent struggle, or of course it is true that the civil rights movement succeeded through nonviolent action. And but at the same time, some people always bring up this argument that, well, in India, Gandhi had his Subhash Chandra Bose and others who were advocating violence or who were using violent methods. And in the civil rights movement, it wasn't just Martin Luther King who did everything. There was actually Malcolm X who made a huge contribution. So there, like these points, these arguments come up every now and then, and people point to the Tibet movement and say that, well, nonviolence is great, but nonviolence alone is not enough to liberate a people. So what are your thoughts on that kind of perception? So do you want to go?
Yeah. So, within the Tibetan freedom movement, the differences are not between violence and non-violence. In fact, I do not really see any lively discussion or debate between violence and non-violence. Here, within the movement that we are running at the moment, the debate is between two different types of non-violence. One is the confrontational non-violence that the general Tibetan communities involved in, which involves in, for example, in the face non-violent strategic action. We come in front of Chinese leaders and protest. People in Tibet every day take up the action and risk of getting arrested, beaten, or even getting killed. These are confrontational, non-violent action. On the other hand, there is the non-confrontational, pacifist movement led by His Holiness, where he believes in dialoguing. His Holiness says he had even advised many of the leaders of activists. He's been saying, do not sit on hunger strike, do not go into the street and protest, do not burn Chinese flags. These will anger the Chinese people. It will shame them. In place of that, talk to them. Dialogue is the only answer. So His Holiness has been talking and mainly stressing on that. So I think these are the two kind of debate that we see within the Tibetan freedom movement. Now, this may be I'm trying to draw attention to what is happening now and where the differences are. But then this is a very, very healthy difference that we see within the community. Or in fact, in the Indian freedom struggle, the differences are much more. There are people willing to go out and kill. Subhash Chandra Bose brought a whole lot of army from outside to fight against the British, the whole empire forces. So in that way, the debate within the Tibetan community is very, very healthy. But then I still believe whether there are people like us who are willing to go out into the street and protest and get beaten or go to jail, or confrontational movements, things that we see inside Tibet, or the dialoguing process that His Holiness has been leading. These are movement that has been firstly sustaining the Tibetan freedom movement. Most importantly, in the process, we have actually realized and understood the strength of non-violent freedom movement. And most importantly, we see that whatever we are doing are actually the emanation, the real practice of Tibetan culture. However, proud that we feel, and especially the younger generation Tibetans who are born outside Tibet or inside Tibet, who are born after 1980s, were never seen the kind of brutality before. This is the younger generation Tibetans who actually value the Tibetan culture, and they see that this same Tibetan culture that we value so much is actually there in practice in the form of our own non-violent freedom movement. And this is the real practice. So the practice of our culture, or culture of non-violence, is here in our freedom struggle. And therefore the freedom struggle makes deeply a sense, not only to a personal level, but even for the national struggle. And therefore I see that this is the most potent freedom struggle, which is not only sustaining the movement, it is giving a deep sense of purpose for every individual in our own life. And so that the freedom struggle is not a legacy that we are just inheriting from our parents, but this is making sense of it, because this is the most firstly fashionable and secondly meaningful ways of living and taking part in the freedom struggle that is our own future.
Yeah. Dotene, what do you think?
I think we 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 need to know that throughout our freedom struggle, uh, until 1974, there has been armed resistance led by Chushigandu, and even during the Chinese occupation time, uh, around 57, 8, 9, there was armed resistance from Eastern Tibet, and His Holiness Dalai Lama has been always, uh, you know, lead Tibetan people and ask people to adopt non-violence through non-violence to achieve our freedom. And until that time, there was a time where in Tibetan the movement there was a two different approach, two different practice has been done by Tibetan people in our freedom movement. And but we should also know that, because I tend to notice that many of our of course in the community, even in Tibetan kind of like community leadership, people are saying that we right now we are doing non-violence through non-violence movement. We are struggling for freedom because we can't afford to have like weapon, because we don't have like army, and no one will support us. I think we should understand that non-violence movement, non-violence means is not a weapon for weak people. I think we should understand how non-violence movement has been waged in the history of different freedom struggle, be it Indian freedom movement, that how it's non-violence movement are powerful, and we consider we consider and going on the path of non-violence movement, because not just because it's morally right, but it is practical, and especially at this time. And I think it is, of course, because of His Holiness Dalai Lama leadership that Tibetans have practiced non-violence movement. But I agree with Tundula that we need to be more strategic. We just need we just need to think about non-violent action, not just talk about non-violence. So I think through that we can see non-violence movement as a strength, and how we can achieve our freedom.
I think, Sindhu, this idea of it's really about confrontation or non-confrontational nonviolence. I think that's the key for me. And the question for me comes down to, if we want to see change happen in Tibet, if we want to help make change on the ground, if we want China, the Chinese government, the Chinese Communist Party, to change their policies now or in the future, then the question is, what is the most effective way to get them to do that? How do we get them to do that? And the obvious answer to me is pressure. They're not going to do it out of the goodness of their hearts. They're not going to do it because they have a change of heart. They're not going to do it, certainly not going to do it if we're really nice to them. So to me, the key is pressure, pressure, pressure. And how do you create pressure on them if you can't use weapons, which I just don't even think is a consideration, and if you can't use, the traditional or non-traditional forms of violent struggle. So then the obvious thing for me is you put pressure on them by rigorous, active, sustained, creative protest and struggle. And that's inside Tibet, and that's in exile. And there's a major role for the international Tibetan community and supporting community here. We have to look at, You know, think of them as the, if you don't want to think of them as the enemy, think of them as the opponent or the opposition, the people that we're trying to reach. And think of what are their strengths, what are their weaknesses, like you would in any competition, sport, you know, struggle, fight. What are their strengths and what are their weaknesses? What are our strengths and weaknesses? And how do we exert pressure on them to, what do they care about? What can we take away from them? What can we deny them? International legitimacy, acceptance. What do they crave? What do they want? And how can we stop them from getting it and say, you know, we are going to work to deny you this international acceptance, credibility. You so desperately want to legitimize your claim over Tibet. You so desperately want to, you know, the Chinese leadership to, you know, to shut Tibet out of any discussions, global, you know, government or non-governmental sort of fora, and here we are. We're going to be here. We're going to pressure you. We're going to relentlessly dog you with the Tibetan question, the Tibetan issue, with the strongest possible approach, not using violence, but using rigorous confrontational nonviolence to, if not make these guys right now change their policies on the ground in Tibet, if that's impossible just by circumstance, then we're going to help educate next generations of Chinese leaders as to what, and to the people even in general right now, to that the fact that Tibet is an issue, it's a problem, it's a stain on their international reputation, it's not going away. It costs them social, economic, and political. It has social, economic, and political costs for them. And when you have a major problem like that, you need a solution. And ideally, one day, the solution for them will be to dialogue and to come to the negotiating table, or to make changes on the ground, even starting with small ones and then ideally bigger ones. You know, to create, we have to create the climate where they feel they have no choice but to address Tibetan grievances. And we will not create that climate. We will not be successful if we believe that the only way to approach them is through a very sort of quiet, that's what they want, I would say. They want us to be quiet and to be kind and to be gentle with them, because they are, that for them is I think, the easiest way to get away with what they're doing. And it's not that there isn't a role for dialogue. It's not that there is not a role for His Holiness's more hand-out approach, but it's that goes together, has to be flanked by, surrounded by rigorous protest, demonstration, pushing, resistance, non-cooperation, boycott. And if we do those things, it's not that we're harming the Chinese or creating a backlash in Tibet. It's that we are helping to make sure there's a solution that will benefit Chinese and Tibetans. Because if we don't push rigorously for change now, there have to be a few hurt feelings for the long run, for there to be peace and for there to be the occupation to end. Because we're only, if this goes unaddressed, if we can't find a way to push for and make change happen, there will be more violence, and the Chinese themselves will suffer in the future, for sure, because it will be an intractable conflict.
I think that's a really great point you raised, Laden, because it made me think of, you know, there's no point in us trying not to hurt Chinese feelings, because Chinese people's feelings have already been hurt, you know. So it just made me think of the Indian freedom struggle, and when Gandhi led the massive boycott movement in India, and that non-cooperation and boycott movement in India, it led to a huge dip in the textile income of the British Empire, you know, but it also led to a huge unemployment of thousands of British women working in the Lancashire mills. But then later on, when Gandhi visited the UK, these same women who have been put out of employment by Gandhi's boycott movement, they gave Gandhi the most rousing, warm, joyous kind of welcome and celebration. You know, they had so much respect for Gandhi and the Indian freedom struggle, and that is the kind of response that we would eventually see in all of the Chinese people or anyone who would be impacted by any kind of equivalent boycott campaign on our side or non-cooperation campaign on our side. And I totally agree that eventually, you know, this is the way to put pressure on the Chinese government. And right now, people might be out there, you know, who think that nonviolence alone is not enough. Nonviolent action alone is not enough. But actually, I want to point out this really interesting study that I highly recommend for anyone out there to read. It's called "Why Civil Resistance Works." And you know, like usually, the argument or the case for nonviolent action for Tibet instead of armed struggle or violence at this point is actually a very easy case. You know, you don't need to have huge deep insight about the workings of political mechanism and all that. I think basic common sense, if somebody with basic common sense, you know, think hard enough about this issue, the argument for nonviolent action, but like, you know, confrontational, aggressive, nonviolent action is very clear. But at the same time, to add to that argument, I think that argument is even made stronger by the empirical study that Chenoweth and Maria Stefan, they have done in their books, Why Civil Resistance Works. And this book comes to the conclusion, basically in their book they have surveyed 323 different struggles over the last 100 years, more than 100 years. And their study of these nonviolent struggles and armed struggles led them to the conclusion that armed struggles over the last 100 years have been successful 26% of the time, whereas nonviolent struggles have been successful 53% of the time, you know. And this is probably the first of its kind in terms of it being an empirical study. But it makes a huge and, you know, very interesting, groundbreaking kind of case for why nonviolent resistance is actually more effective than armed resistance. So, like all three of you said, you know, the reason why the Tibetan movement continues our commitment to nonviolent resistance is not only because, or is not because we are bad at violence, or it's not because violence has no chance with China, or it's not because, you know, nonviolence is the weapon of the weak or is the weapon of the strong, or all that moral side of things. But I think in the end, the case that makes it, you know, cemented for us is because nonviolent resistance actually works, you know. And in some cases where like there had been violent flanks in those movements, whether in India or civil rights movement or any other places like South Africa, the violent flanks in those movements actually hurt the overall chances of these nonviolent movements of succeeding, you know. So that's just like something I wanted to throw out there. I know we are running out of time, so we have, like, we started 10 minutes late, right?
Yeah.
Right. So okay. So I'll just throw the and maybe I'll throw in the. Go ahead, Lan.
So I just want to say, if people want to put questions, we have a couple of comments, a nice message of season's greetings to all. But if people want to post questions on the website, on the event page, you can. There should be a feature that you can see to Q&A to post a question, and we'll see them here, and then we can answer them directly, hopefully.
Okay. And oh, go ahead, Dosiden. Yeah.
Sorry. As you mentioned about particularly in terms of like different non-violence tactic, and I recently read your monograph, and I really appreciate, like, especially we were to go through it, and I have been like thinking in the recent time that for Tibetan activists like us in exile, we really need to understand more closely situation inside Tibet. And it is not that Tibetans inside Tibet has not practiced those confrontational different tactics. We have seen like a place like in Zadu, how intervention on time by thousands of people had stopped mining activity inside Zadu area, and companies were closed down. And at the same time, we discuss about Lagar movement, how through non-cooperation movement in many regions, people had practiced boycott movement. And I think it is really important, especially at this time for us, because now we have more access in terms of different internet, social media tool to understand more closely inside Tibet. And Tibetan people inside Tibet has been also paying attention on the different subject, and I mean different ideas of non-violence, as in some of the part, as in some of like boycott vegetable campaign in Nangchen, they have mentioned that they are inspired by the Gandhi's non-violence movement. So how we can replicate and how we can uh, give this knowledge from one place to all different part of Tibetan area. I think this is really important and interesting that we talk about global action outside, but at the same time inside Tibet, how they can increase the pressure, how they can uh, implement different tactics of non-violence. And in your monograph, you had did a research. I think it is really important for us to be to do more such kind of work and to understand more the geographical, the different landscape of Tibet, different conditions, because sometimes we see and we project that Tibet as just one thing, and we know that in different areas there are different situations. So to understand that and how this non-violence movement can expand in different part of Tibet.
Thanks, yeah, thanks, Docheten, for promoting my monograph. but it seems like, yeah, you anticipated actually my last question for the group, which was actually exactly that particular issue about inside Tibet. You know, a lot of people think, or a lot of people say that there was no space for anything inside Tibet. And actually, like, if you go by different kinds of ratings, especially Freedom House ratings, Tibet consistently ranks as one of the worst, most oppressed places on the planet, which means there is very extremely limited political space for organizing, any kind of organizing in Tibet, you know. And then that seems to lead many people to say, there is nothing that's possible in Tibet, you know. But at the same time, we're seeing all these amazing, brilliant organizing, brilliant actions that Tibetans inside are continuing to organize their resistance around. So there is, like, you know, with whatever limited space they have, because eventually, no matter how repressed a country is, even North Korea, you know, no matter how repressed a country is, people can always find small pockets of space for resistance if they are creative enough. And in Tibet, they seem to be doing it. And how can we, exactly your question, how can we expand that space? How can we exploit that space? Or how can, what are some other ways, or what are the ways in which Tibetans inside Tibet can continue to push the envelope, while Tibetans outside and our supporters can promote this kind of possibility and this kind of awareness? To wrap up our discussion, any comments or thoughts on that?
Well, I'll go on that again first. You know, when I was in Tibet many years ago, I was in Lhasa, in jail, in situ detention camp. I could see that there was almost no hope for those who are inside the jail. You know, there is absolute control. Number of people had no access to either legal support or even parents and family. The Chinese government has a way of, you know, keeping prisoners in different, shifting them to places where they have no access whatsoever. Even families wouldn't know where they have been shifted to. But even there, what I found is, in the jail, Tibetans were saying prayers. Tibetans were, you know, doing physical exercises. They were singing songs. and there were Chinese guards who are on the outside, holding these heavy machine guns, and they seem to be much more worried and insecure than those who are on the inside in the jails. So what most importantly I noticed is a very unique spirit of the warrior that the Tibetans are. I may sound very romantic in here, but this is the reality. I saw a very unique sense of spirit in the Tibetan people, and this has always been my real source of inspiration personally. How do I continue to be the activist and maintain my own strength? Now, but on ground reality, Tibetans today inside Tibet are facing a situation, something like how the white Americans try to settle down Native Americans in reservations, buying the land, the animals, and settling down them in these ready-made houses, and said to them, now you do not need to work. Now everything will be taken care of. So there is a danger of a whole movement getting settled down. But what the Tibetans are also doing today is being creative in the times where there is absolute oppression on them by law, by state propaganda, which they call it media, and by the state government, use of Chinese languages in so many different places, and then bringing in all these roads, railways, what is called development, which are actually there to harness further natural resources, which is their real aim, out of Tibet to feed the industries in China. And even at such time when there is absolute no space for even protests or express their grievances, Tibetans have been most successful in bringing about creative means of protest, and Hakar movement is the best example. And these are the Tibetan nomads and farmers, students who have never studied Gandhi or Martin Luther King or even Professor Gene Sharp's methods of nonviolent action, strategic nonviolence. So I constantly see that there is this strength of creating creative non-violent action in different times, at the same time maintain that kind of a spirit. And they have, for me, truly the real source of inspiration for me, and I believe that such kind of a strength will not only sustain the movement, but carry on the movement even in future. But again, let me because the concluding line, let me just round it up. The Tibetan movement alone is not enough in the freedom struggle. We need to see what the Tibetans outside can do to add to it. It is time is enough to say we are poor Tibetan refugees, please support us. Now is the time for educated young people spread across the world with international contacts to see how we can play into the politics, economic relations around the world, and see how we could relate the issue of Tibet in their interests, and then see how we could bring them around. And for me, the important opportunity being here in India is how the issue of Tibet, the long-term interest of India, we could relate to them and continue to seek India's support, not because they are sympathetic, but because they have a direct interest in the freedom, in the Tibetan freedom struggle. And I'm always being very optimistic about it. And this is the ground reality optimism that feeds the future hope for me.
I definitely think that the situation on the ground, there's a lot more possible than people think. I think people imagine like the end sort of scenario, like you saw, say, in Egypt in Tahrir or in Ukraine or something. People imagine these mass protest gatherings and bringing down the dictator and sort of think like that's just not possible in Tibet. You can't even build a movement to get there. But I think the key is that the resistance, cultural resistance, different kind of a more quiet non-cooperation, boycott strategies, at times like these when the political repression and the cost of action inside Tibet is so high, I think we have seen Tibetans engaging in these other kinds of strategies that allow them to do essential things at this moment, which is build power, build unity, build pride, teach the next generation about what it means to be Tibetan and to hold on to language and culture, and to say we are Tibetan, not Chinese. I mean, all of these things, they're quite revolutionary, they're very powerful, and these things can be done in a way that the costs do not have to be directly so high and so painful as walking in the street and raising a flag or, you know, having a protest gathering. But you can have more people being involved, and you can build your movement and build people's buy-in and participation over time. I think one of the best examples of Tibetan cultural resistance is the No Losar movement of 2009 specifically. Because after 2008 and the uprising and the protests and the Chinese crackdown and the unbelievable repression, you know, troops had flooded into Tibet. There was just like no possibility almost of protest or continued street resistance. So what did Tibetans do? At a time when you would think they had the least amount of power and the least amount of organizing ability, they somehow took power back from the Chinese by saying, in a really creative and sort of brilliant strategy, we will show our displeasure, we will show our strength, and we will show our unity as a people by not celebrating our own cultural, you know, holiday or the New Year's, the Losar, the kind of most fun and important cultural celebration in Tibet, holiday in Tibet. We will take back power from you by doing something that is saying we won't do something that is our own anyway. And it just made it very complicated and very difficult for the Chinese to control. It allowed Tibetans to feel a sense of pride and resistance and control over their own lives. And it was hard for the Chinese to crack down on Tibetans and say, you must celebrate, you must enjoy Losar. I mean, it was a real conundrum for them. And I think that is the kind of brilliant jiu-jitsu sort of protest strategy, cultural resistance, that helps keep people's, like, it's so important to keep morale up and to keep momentum moving forward and building. And you can't keep running into their bayonets, right? You can't keep running straight into the line of fire and people drop and die and then get taken to prison. And then, you know, you can't sustain that in a way. But what you can sustain are these more clever, creative protest strategies, I think. And they really help. This is what it's about, building the movement and sustaining the movement and the sense of Tibet and everything inside Tibet from now until the future where more will be possible. It will not always be like this. Change will come. More space will come. And if you have kept the people strong and together and building momentum, but also not just having these sort of you know, just very high cost, difficult, painful strategies, then we will be able to, Tibetans inside Tibet will be able to really make change happen.
Thank you, guys. I think, yeah, in terms of being able to sustain our struggle through these tactics of what we would call tactics of dispersion, right? These low-risk tactics, low-cost tactics that are spread out, that people can take part in individually. I think these would make the Tibet movement, yeah, more sustainable than the Chinese Empire. And I think that's always good for us to remember that the Chinese Empire, regardless of how big it is And in fact, actually, because of how big it is actually very, very unsustainable, and it has continued to grow more and more unsustainable every year, every day. And I think, yeah, we should always remember that the biggest things are actually usually the most unsustainable things, you know. And empires of everything, empires are the ones that last much less, much shorter, over a much shorter time than nations. You know, empires are bigger than nations, but nations are the ones that win out in the end. Nations last much longer than empires, and Tibet is a nation. China today is an empire. So we'll just take our cue from that, you know. And there was one thing that I want to actually plug in here, which is in terms of, since we talked a lot about nonviolent resistance and nonviolent action, and His Holiness has been actually one of the, you know, like without a doubt, the key figure, the main figure in the Tibet movement who has advocated for and promoted our commitment to nonviolence for all this time. And this year, His Holiness turned 80 years old. And in keeping with that occasion, or to celebrate that moment and occasion, you know, some of us, all of us here, plus some of our other friends who are, you know, writers, artists, and poets and activists, some of us came together to launch this initiative called the Nonviolence Pledge, which is, we urge anyone who is part of the Tibet movement, or who is interested in human rights and freedom, who has some kind of, you know, commitment to nonviolence, or who feel that nonviolence can liberate people, or who feel that nonviolence should be the chosen method. Anyone of this kind of belief, we urge them to sign this pledge called the Nonviolence Pledge, which is basically a pledge to take nonviolent action for Tibet in honor of His Holiness, to celebrate His Holiness's 80th birthday. So yeah, the website, the link for that is nonviolencepledge.org. We urge you to please go to that site and make a pledge today, and share that link with your friends. So that's just one very quick plug I wanted to put in.
And if I could just add to that, Tindor, one of the reasons we launched this nonviolencepledge.org is because we really wanted to, at the time of His Holiness's 80th birthday, highlight this fact that he is not just an icon of nonviolence in the Tibetan context, but His Holiness the 14th Dalai Lama is an icon of nonviolence for the entire world and for, you know, global human history. He has made such an incredible impact. He has reached so many people with his message, and people are actively receiving it all over the world. And we don't think in the way His Holiness actually gets that recognition that he should, that he stands with the giants of history, Martin Luther King, Mahatma Gandhi. He's living right here among us today, and what better way to celebrate his 80th birthday and his life than to make this kind of pledge and commitment at this time, especially as the future of Tibet and the future of the planet is so much in question, or seems so uncertain.
And very quickly for people.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
Just adding to that. Yeah, I'm just saying, this truly can actually be our tribute to His Holiness the Dalai Lama at this age, and also the legacy that he left behind. And most importantly, as Tibetans born and brought up in India, the second generation Tibetans, we are proud that His Holiness the Dalai Lama was actually become the symbol of peace and non-violence around the world. He's our leader, and we are happy that we are following his footsteps. And what better way to celebrate than to not just to say Your Holiness, you're great, but commit yourself in this. And I've myself and signed on this. I've made my own commitment. I've asked a number of my friends, many of my own friends. I've asked they themselves, even a number of Indian friends, they have signed and committed to it. So I request all other, those who are here watching this, to sign up and commit to non-violence. And this is perhaps the best way to pay our tribute to His Holiness, that you are great, and I would like to follow your footsteps. At least I can commit my personal, discipline to non-violence. And this is the best way to celebrate His Holiness, the Dalai Lama, when he's 80 years old.
Thank you, Jindu. So it is 1:22 right now. We have gone a little bit over an hour. I feel like we should probably wrap it up before it gets too long. So any last thoughts or comments? Maybe Dotede, do you have any last thoughts?
So, whatever you right now said about the non-violence movement, the space we can create inside Tibet, I think we don't need to be, as a Tibetan outside and as a Tibetan people who continue to our struggle in exile. We don't need to feel sometimes fearful about, how we can contribute Tibet in the struggle inside Tibet. Because China, of course, all the time blame that whatever happened, it is because instigated by Tibetan people outside Tibet. It is instigated by His Holiness Dalai Lama or our exile government or Tibetan Youth Congress or other groups. I think, and then sometimes we say that, oh, no, we are just here to stand in solidarity, and we are here to support and to amplify the voice. I think this is the time now to make ourselves more connected and understand about the situation inside Tibet and find the space and how we can contribute inside. There is nothing to be fear about, because we are struggling for our country, our home, and we can definitely, through non-violence, and we have the rights to do that because this is our country. So therefore, I think as an activist like us, and of course, we should have more, especially from whether from our government in exile. I feel like now this is time that we should have a more organized kind of non-violence movement. How we can increase the, as we said, the space and increase the resistance inside Tibet, and not just saying that don't do this and that, but we can give the answer what to do. And then, as we discussed about, there's so many things, and Tibetan people inside are waiting for that. I think by doing that, I think we can increase the pressure inside, both inside and outside. And ultimately, right now, I consider right now Tibetan movement is so strong, and it is because that right now time is not with us, and Chinese regime is powerful and to acknowledge. But at the same time, as we have seen in the history, that the more repression, there is a more resistance happening. And right now in China, we can see there are people resisting in mainland China, in East Turkestan, in southern Mongolia. Hong Kong people are fighting for their rights. And so what we see is that there's a huge increase of people's resistance in China. And we know that by increase of those resistance, Chinese government right now, CCP, is more fearful and kind of like, and we know that their own act will one day make them unable to function, and at that time I think will be the opportunity for us. So we have to continue to strengthen our movement, I think.
Great, thank you. And Lardon, do you have any final thoughts you wanted to add before we close?
Lardon, go ahead.
I was just thinking, two things. I'm actually at a friend's house right now, and the reason that this is not my home, but my friend's home, I ended up sitting in front of this poster, and I just, this is not about a discussion of President Obama's policies or presidency, but the simple fact that he is the President of the United States of America should be a reminder to all of us that anything is possible, that change will certainly come to Tibet and certainly come to China, because there will always be the people who say change is not possible, this is not possible, that is not possible. But the reality is this, if you 50 years ago, 30 years ago, 100 years ago, you would not find many people who would say an African American is going to be the president of the United States anytime soon. In fact, most people would have said it won't happen. And of course, not only did it happen, but two-term president, we cannot let ourselves be fooled or tricked into thinking that the current state of affairs is the way that things will be forever. It feels long to us, these 6 decades of the occupation of Tibet, but in the great span of history, this is a short time, and empires rise and fall, everything changes. Tibetans, as Buddhists, we should believe in the fact that everything changes, and understand that that is the nature of existence. And so, let us not be completely restricted and scared and operate from a place of fear and limited possibilities. We need to expand our minds and really try to examine the nature of this reality that things will change and that anything is possible. And when we operate from that position, then not only is nonviolence, nonviolent action a viable sort of method or path for Tibetan freedom and independence, but I think the entire ground and our whole perspective will shift. And I think finally that these are difficult days for certain. We all feel them. We all feel the stress or the sort of sometimes the internal Tibetan political situation feels quite difficult and kind of overwhelming. But I always think of this thing that a friend said to me, to us a long time ago in a group, which was that despair is not an option. Despair is a luxury. We cannot look at the circumstances Tibetans are facing inside Tibet, and still people resist, and still they find a way to make their voices heard, and they move forward, and they continue to struggle. And so in exile, it's a little depressing or inconvenient that there are some divisions and some arguments and whatever right now. But I think we together and personally have to keep our eyes on the prize and think bigger. Don't think small, and don't think in this sort of tiny myopic Tibetan world. Think big and think about what are the possibilities.
So last word.
Yeah, just last few words. When I meet Chinese coming from mainland China, meeting them here in India or any of the foreign countries, they are unable to speak freely. They are always on the nerve. They always fear that someone is watching them.
Mm.
So what I see is that China is in the grip of fear. They know that the central government is watching them individually. So what is under fear, it cannot stay, it cannot live forever. But very often we get overwhelmed by the economic might of China today. China is, in the recent 1 year, China has created, firstly, the BRIC Nations Bank. China has also created Asian Infrastructure Bank, where more than about 50 countries have invested in or they've promised. China is creating the Silk Route all across Asia, and they're going to connect it to Europe. So, sometimes we get overawed by such, gigantic infrastructure, such gigantic international involvement in China's economic, activity. Tibet can never be free, and many of the analysts always say that if China is rising to such a strength, how can Tibet ever be free? But what we forget to see is how China has been able to do that. Most importantly, China has been using obedience in their own people, uh, either promising greed or silencing their own people with fear, and that's how China has been able to rule over their own people. And taking advantage of the dictatorship there, China used its own people, 900 million workforce, and created the industries of the world, which then benefited most of the Western countries, for whom it's a trade, link, it's a trade relationship, but they ended up giving legitimacy to the Chinese government. But all of that is changing now. A number of countries are now taking away their investments from China to a number of other countries. Many of them are actually coming to here, to India. It is going to Burma, a new democratic country now emerging. So what we are now seeing is the restlessness in Chinese people inside China, the hostility rising between China and the international companies, especially the Western countries, and the rising confidence of the Tibetan people and the people of other occupied countries like East Turkestan, Mongolia, and other affected countries like Mongolia and Taiwan and Hong Kong. So we actually see so many signs of positivity all across and around China, and therefore, this is the promise that I'm looking at. We should not look at Tibet alone in isolation. We look at the larger picture of China and the international picture. So there's a large landscape where so much of positive signs are coming about, and therefore now is the time to really rack up brains and see how those of us who are outside Tibet, we can connect with the international community and see and take opportunities that are coming about, take advantage of that, and see how we could add on to the pressure that is already exerting on China, and Xi Jinping will have to relent someday to his own people and the pressures from around the world to really see freedom in China, democracy in China, and freedom for Tibet. And this has always been my dream to see free Tibet. A number of people say that Tibet, the Tibetan freedom struggle is for Tibetans inside Tibet. But for me, freedom of Tibet is so very personal for me. Like number of Tibetans in India, without free Tibet, we have no security whatsoever. We are not citizen of any country. Only freedom of Tibet can and is the only future directly, personally, for us. And therefore, freedom of Tibet is my own life. If there is free Tibet, there is freedom to me. Or else, we just end up here in exile with no security whatsoever. So I believe in freedom of Tibet, and I know that it is already come.
Thank you, Sundu. Thanks to everyone who joined us today, and thanks to all of our friends, Sundu, Ladu, and Tosede, for this lively discussion. And in closing, Sundu just now said something about how the freedom of Tibet is important not only to Tibetans but also to Indians and also to Chinese, and I would go even further and state that freedom of Tibet is something that should matter to every human being who believes in nonviolence or who does not believe in war, who shuns war and violent conflict. Anyone out there, you don't have to be Tibetan or Chinese or Indian or anything. If you believe that the world should leave behind warfare and violent struggle or violent conflict, if you are bothered by violence, then there is no better argument for peace and nonviolence than success for Tibet, than victory for Tibet. You know, the exact reason why many people might point to Tibet and say, oh, you know, it should not concern me because it's a small country with 6 million people, now maybe 6.5 or 7 million people. You know, in the bigger scheme of things, it's such a small, tiny place that it should not concern big agenda in the world. Why should it concern me, you know? But at the crux of it, at the crux of all of our struggle to make the world more peaceful, one of the missing links is, you know, people are still not able to convince anyone that nonviolent resistance is more effective. Because if that can be convinced, if people can be convinced that nonviolence is more effective than violence, then that will be the end of war, you know. And I think Tibet is the ultimate laboratory to test the effectiveness of nonviolence. And of course, we have the moral arguments, we have the empirical arguments, but when Tibet achieves freedom through nonviolent resistance, that will be the strongest argument anyone could ever make to forsake war and violent conflict. So with that, I want to thank all of you for watching, and please visit this link once again, nonviolencepledge.org, and make a pledge today to take nonviolent action for Tibet. Thank you, Sunjul Haren Dosede, once again.
Thank you, Tendor, for hosting it.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks, everybody, and I just want to acknowledge the questions that came in and the really nice comments. Thank you. We addressed the questions basically in our talk, and for the people who said very encouraging and supportive things, thank you for your support and for tuning in. And this link will be live, this discussion will be online forever, I hope. And so please share this with your friends, and people can watch this after the fact. So thanks, you guys. Good night, Dharmsala.
Yeah, thanks for staying up.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.